When my wife, Kim, and I were first married, I had a weird pet peeve about nativity sets. You know, nativity sets, those little manger scenes, visual depictions of the birth of Jesus that people set up around the house during the holidays. I love them. We've got a bunch of them, but I will admit that it's always bothered me that they kind of compress time. They tend to have shepherds and wise men and sheep and camels and cows all gathered around the Holy Family, all together, all gazing adoringly at the Christ child all at once. And beyond the fact that I am not so sure the sheep and cattle were actually gazing longingly at Jesus, although he was like sleeping in their food trough, so maybe they were, but just because they were hungry, right? Like, I imagine, right, they were probably actually, they would have been, how do I put this? Acting like sheep and cattle, and noisily wandering around the barn, eating hay, smelling bad. But that's not the point. Beyond that, these nativity scenes kind of annoyed me because the shepherds and the wise men, also known as the Magi or the kings from the east, the shepherds and the wise men were, according to the story, not actually there at the same time. In Luke's gospel story, the shepherds arrive that night within hours of the birth of Jesus. They gather around the manger, they hear the good news of this unexpected king, and then they go out into the world to tell others what they have heard and seen. But the wise men, they do not show up, according to Matthew's story, until something like 2 years after Jesus is born. Jesus and his parents would not have been at the manger when the wise men got there. 2 years is a long time to live in a barn. They seem to have been living just, in a house. This delay, the 2 years between the birth of Jesus and when the Magi show up, is, by the way, as our children pointed out, one of the reasons that we tell this story almost 2 weeks after Christmas Day on the holiday we call Epiphany, because it took a while after Christmas for the wise men to get to Jesus. Epiphany, which we are celebrating today, is a celebration of God's light shining in dark places, of God being revealed to the whole world, of outsiders, including the wise men, coming from every corner of the world to encounter the God who has been born to save us. So anyway, back to my pet peeve about nativity sets. I did not want the Magi to be in the nativity set before Christmas because, it took them a long time to get there. So they shouldn't be there waiting all Advent long. They should, you would think, show up after Christmas Day. Now, I will admit that this is a silly thing to be upset about. Being married to a pastor is exhausting, I'm pretty confident. My wife is a saint, most certainly, etc. But still went with it. When we had kids, I came up with a plan. I decided that when we set up the house for Christmas, the weekend after Thanksgiving each year, that we would put the wise men from our big, lovingly crafted wooden nativity set, wise men that are each about 8 inches tall, we'd put the wise men on the other side of the house from the rest of the nativity set. And then slowly, over the course of the month of December, we would move the wise men across the house from bookshelf to countertop to end table until finally, sometime around New Year's Day, as close to Epiphany as we could get, but still having them get set up before we put stuff away, we brought them to the nativity set itself and we set them up there. It was a little bit ridiculous, and it meant we very rarely actually got to see our nativity set fully assembled. But it was also fun, and it was a great way to teach the story to our children as we moved the wise men a little bit every night. It was great. That is, it was great until it wasn't. You see, one year, when we were moving the wise men from one spot to another on their little journey across our living room, I dropped one of the, might I note, relatively expensive, I dropped one of these wise men figures, and his head snapped off. I glued it back on, but he has not been the same since. And fun fact, that was the last year that we moved the wise men around the house. Now they get set up right there with the shepherds right when we start setting up the house for Christmas. In this case, we decided that biblical accuracy in our holiday decor needed to be sacrificed so that I don't break any more of our stuff. As absurd as that story is, The Magi who lost his head in my family's nativity set is not entirely unconnected from the story that we read this morning. Because even though we don't typically notice it, this story that we read this morning is a story that is drenched in violence. We often don't think of it that way. But as Matthew tells the story, the wonder and joy at the birth of Jesus quickly gives way to the danger of powerful people who seek to destroy him. This is a story not just of wonder, but of grief. It's a story not just of the Prince of Peace, but of those who resist the way of peace by means of violence. It's a story not just about the God who is doing a new thing, but about powerful people who will stop at nothing to resist any change that might put their own power and control at risk. In other words, this story is a reminder that God's light, the light that shines for all the world to see, the light that we celebrated so joyously at Christmas, God's light enters into a world of real darkness. God does not enter into a sanitized world. Sometimes when we read the Bible, we are tempted to read it with rose-colored glasses, to imagine that things were somehow different back then, that people and the world that they lived in were more holy than ours. But this story makes it clear that that is not the case. When God becomes one of us, God enters into a world like ours, a world full of danger and despair, a world full of violence and hatred and evil. King Herod, whose official title was King of the Jews and who was willing to do anything to hold on to his power, he killed his own wife, his own brother, his own son when they were threats to his position. Well, when the murderous man called King of the Jews hears that someone else has been born to usurp that title, that there is a new king in town, he tries to hunt down this new king, this threat to his throne. He tells the wise men to return after they found this new king so that he can offer his own well wishes. But thanks to a warning from God, though you would imagine that they might have had their own suspicions, the wise men do not return to Herod, but instead they sneak home by another route. And when Herod realizes that he has been duped, that he has lost his source of information on this new would-be king, he flies into a rage, deciding that if he cannot figure out which young child in Bethlehem is a threat to his throne, that he will just eliminate them all. Herod's violence is fueled by anger, which in turn is fueled by fear. How often, I wonder, do we act out and do harm to others and express inappropriate anger because deep down we are afraid of what's happening in our lives, afraid of what we see around us in our world, afraid of not being in control, afraid of change and what it means for us. How often do we, like Herod, cause harm to innocent people because we're afraid of what we might lose? Anyway, this is a horrific story. God, it seems, has chosen to face down the worst imaginable violence by stepping right into the middle of it. God, when God becomes one of us, chooses to bring love by diving deep into the worst of our hatred. God chooses to intervene in our violence by becoming a vulnerable child who must run for his life before he can even walk. God chooses to face down the powerful by becoming a refugee. God chooses to reveal God's power and glory by becoming a powerless peasant, an infant who is entirely dependent upon his parents for survival, a homeless immigrant on the run from violent government forces who seek to do him harm. The child who the wise men seek, who they come from across the known world to worship, who they travel for years to encounter. This child, the one who we believe reveals God to us, who is himself God as one of us. This child's glory is found in weakness. His home is found among the homeless. Jesus brings bread from heaven, and yet he willingly goes hungry for us. He is our peace, and yet he willingly suffers violence. He is our hope, and yet he is unafraid of situations that to us seem hopeless. The Magi at the start of this story treat Jesus and his parents like royalty. Soon after the Magi leave, that same family has become refugees, living as strangers in the foreign land of Egypt because their homeland is not safe for them. That's how God shows up. That's where we are told to look if we want to discover the divine presence among us. And so as we step into a new year, this story is a reminder for us to be on the lookout for the light of God's love shining in unexpected places. It's a reminder that God has chosen to be with us as one who is vulnerable. The Magi went to great lengths to find Jesus, and when they finally found him, it was not in the halls of power, but among the powerless, not among the mighty, but among the weak, not in the center, but on the margins. On Epiphany, we tell the story of the one who has been born to reveal God's light to us, of the people who cross the known world to seek that light out. We remember that the light of God's love can shine, does shine, even in the darkest places, at the darkest times, in situations that feel hopeless and fearful and uncertain. And we trust that if God could do that then, if when God chose to be one of us, God willingly stepped in to a place of pain and revealed God's self to a bunch of foreigners and outsiders and lived among us as one of the suffering, if God chose to do that then God can do it yet again. No part of your life is too dark for God to shine in it. No part of your story is too painful for God's grace to be active in it. No part of our world is too violent for God to be present and working in it. God's story still shows up in the least expected places. God's grace is still there for us in the moments when everything seems to be falling apart. God's presence is still with us in moments of fear and of wonder, of pain and of hope. God is with us. That's the story of Epiphany, of a God whose light shines no matter what. That's the story of Jesus. And it's the best news there has ever been. Amen.